We are thrilled to be here today and for the next few days to talk about these topics that are going to be impacting cities and really pushing the conversation. I want to talk for a moment about how it is that we got here. And this really started about 2 years ago at the University of Oregon, that we started to think about what was happening, the impacts that emerging technologies were going to be having on cities. And what we did, as most university people do, we started researching, looking at what was out there. And we're at first surprised and thrilled a little bit, being a researcher, at the lack of research there was around these secondary impacts, these other impacts on cities, not just their technologies. Very soon after that, as we started to look more and more into this, that thrill turned into a little bit of terror. When you start looking at what kinds of impacts there might be upon cities, upon our communities, we thought, oh my goodness, we really need to start working on this. We really need to get good people's heads into this, and we need to start getting ready. And soon after that was the idea that what we need to do is really get a whole lot of minds together who are interested in these topics and working on these topics, talking to each other so that we could do the work, the groundwork that's necessary to be able to have positive outcomes with these emerging technologies. There's a lot of opportunities, there's a lot of risk, as Rob and Chase will be talking about later. So I want to do a little bit of introduction of some of the way that we think about this and kind of set the stage for these next few days. If you Google future city, this is one of the first images that comes up. And I've shown this in other places, and people say a Blade Runner, right? As an architect, I'm kind of excited about that. And it's like sleek and dark and black, and as Becky Stecker likes to say, that probably people wear black turtlenecks all over the place in the city. And we look at this and we think, all right, that's the future city. We're okay, right? Because our cities don't look like that, so we've not hit the future yet, right? The problem is that the future of the city looks like this. So this is Phoenix. So Waymo right now, today, right this moment, has level 4 automation. That's cars with no one in the front seat running in the Phoenix area, in Chandler, right? And so this new technology has arrived, and yet our cities still look the way that our cities have always looked. So it's almost like we still keep thinking that we're in the same place and it's okay. And that's absolutely not the case. We really need to be starting to think about what the impacts are going to be to our cities. So oftentimes when I talk about these topics, I'm asked, okay, when's this going to happen? Is this real? And this is a slide that from the New York Times that looks at the uptake of new technologies across society. And so the interesting thing is you can look at it, and the things like the telephone took about 100 years to get to 95% adoption. That long, slow line coming across top. As we get closer to the present, you'll notice the lines get steeper and steeper. So the cell phone took 10 years to get to that same rate. So the moral here is that as soon as we get technologies available to us, we bring them into our lives much, much faster. So where are we with these technologies? In this ancient history of September of 2016, which is soon after we started looking at these topics, for the first time, you could get into an AV in a city. Pittsburgh started Uber, and Pittsburgh started that in Singapore. That was in 2016. At the time, we thought that was revolutionary. That seems like old news. In November of 2017, this last year, in Black Friday, there were more online sales than there were in-store sales for the 3rd year in a row. Last year, nearly 7,000 stores closed in this country. Largely because of e-commerce impacts. And that's in a thriving economy, right? So these changes are not a kind of future thing. These changes have arrived. Our cities are already that future city, and I don't think we quite figured that out yet. In June of 2017, which we couldn't believe it, 10 of the top 11 car manufacturers in the world said that they would have AVs to market by 2021. This was last year, and we thought 2021, oh my goodness, that's crazy, that's really happening. And then Waymo, in November of last year, started having level 4 automation in Phoenix, and in January of this year, said that they were going to roll out ride sourcing level 4 AVs, in other words, no one in the front seat, no one needed to drive throughout the country. These things that, as Jerry Turney likes to say, went from science fiction to science fact in a really short amount of time. And where the technologies are really shifting, what we haven't really understood yet, and the reason that we're all here today is to think about what those implications are for cities. So as I mentioned before, the things that we're really interested in at Urbanism Next is three things: autonomous vehicles, e-commerce, and the sharing economy. And we're not really interested in the technologies themselves. What we're really interested in is what we call the secondary impacts on cities. How are these things going to have effects on things like land use, land valuation, equity, street design, neighborhood design, municipal budgets? There's a whole lot of interesting work going to be displayed in the next few days on municipal budgets, pressures on sprawl, all these types of issues. To give you a sense of some of the ways that we're thinking about secondary impacts, I wanted to just take one issue and kind of help kind of plant a scenario of how this works across all these different issues. So parking. If there's one thing that we know about autonomous vehicles, and we're already seeing it with transportation network companies, Uber and Lyft, right, TNCs, that there's going to be a huge reduction in the amount of parking that we need. If I own my own car, it just dropped me off here today and then went off to pick up my wife or pick up my daughter. If I didn't own my own car, and I actually got here on Lyft today, right? If I get here on Lyft, that car is now picking somebody else up. In both those scenarios, we don't need parking. With shared shared mobility, the TNCs, the parking reduction goes down even further. And so there's studies that have shown that we might need something like 10 to 15% of the parking that exists in the country right now, right? Huge reductions in the amount of parking. So what kinds of impacts does that have? Well, for one thing, all of a sudden, we have a tremendous opportunity for development. A lot of the times, the limitation on building, how much we can build in terms of density, has nothing to do with the height restrictions and nothing to do with FAR, floor area ratios. What it has to do with is how much parking we can put into a place. If we no longer have that, we can densify tremendously in cities. And not just in urban areas, but also in suburban areas. The suburban office park, the idea of this building surrounded by these seas of parking, we don't need that anymore. The strip mall, with all the parking, up 40, 50% of the land being used for parking, all of a sudden we don't need that anymore. So there's huge opportunities for densification. And huge implications for housing. If anyone here who's ever worked on development of housing, one of the largest limitations of how many units can I put on that property have to do with how much parking I can put on that property. We take that away, and all of a sudden the feasibility of project goes through the roof, and at the same time the cost of projects comes down. We don't have to pay for that parking, we don't have to pay for the land for that parking, right? So again, all these cascading kind of effects. But then on the other hand, there's this other piece that happens, which is what happens with land supply? So according to Donald Shoup, the largest single land use by surface area in most all American cities is parking. What happens unseen in this country if at one time, all of a sudden, over a few years, that land becomes available? Huge changes in the land supply. We could be tripling, quadrupling, quintupling the amount of land that we have available. In San Francisco, that might not have that much of an effect. We don't have a ton of parking there right now, thank goodness. Right? In Portland, we've got a good amount of parking here. That's all of a sudden there's a good opportunities for densification. What happens in suburban cities? Right? Huge shifts in the amount of land that becomes available for development. Huge opportunities for densification. So that's all the cities that we talked about are places that have huge growth pressures. What happens in a city like Cleveland, where already there's not enough development demand? All of a sudden, we've increased the land supply tremendously over a short period of time. If we think about supply and demand, there's going to be significant impacts. At the same time, we have e-commerce taking over a whole lot of development, or a whole lot of the retail sector. Huge drops in the number of stores, as we said before. This is leaving large areas of land unused, blight in communities, land available for redevelopment. So when you think about all these pieces of land becoming available, it has a huge effect on property values, right? So if we just think about supply and demand, if we've just quintupled the amount of supply of land available, property values should drop. On the one hand, fantastic for affordable housing, fantastic for someone who's going out to buy their own home potentially, a little bit troubling for those of us who own property already. And then on the other hand, what happens to property taxes? right? If we reduce property values, we reduce property taxes. We've done a whole report with Ben Clark and Roberta Mann from the University of Oregon looking at municipal budgets. Huge impacts, not only for this, but a lot of different areas based on the impacts on revenue and expenditures because of these new technologies. On the other hand, so another example, so we're looking there, this idea of parking all of a sudden is having effects on everything from land use, land availability, development pressures, land values, all throughout the city. Another secondary impact I'll just go through, or another scenario, is this idea of our commutes. So right now, the average commute in the United States is 25 minutes. When we go to AVs, 25 minutes is going to get us further and further away, right? Because the AVs are much more efficient than we are at driving, right? So you double that and add to it the idea that we might actually have a better use of time while we're on that commute. And instead of having to drive, I might be able to work, watch a movie, do exercise, sleep. And my sense is there'll be cars that are optimized for each one of those types of activities, right? And when that starts to happen, all of a sudden, well, maybe instead of a 25-minute commute, I'm willing to accept a 35-minute commute. So now I can go further, and I'm willing to have a longer commute time. What does that do for the pressure on sprawl? Here in Oregon, we've got urban growth boundaries that limit the expansion of the metropolitan footprint. What happens in Atlanta? What happens in Dallas? Right? What happens in cities that don't have really strong smart growth measures and the pressures that happen with that? And a big question then is, where do we all want to live? If more than anything, I want to live in a house with a yard, or if more than anything, I want to live out in the woods, all of a sudden maybe I can do those things, right? So the pressures on sprawl will be tremendously strong. And as we all know, that has lots of secondary impacts that we're all interested in. Ask any mayor how much they enjoy paying for their infrastructure and maintaining their infrastructure, and it is a headache across the country, right? We've built a ton of infrastructure that we do not have revenue sources for. Oh, and by the way, the gas tax might go away because as we move towards electrification, right? Huge impacts on these issues. What happens to the environment? So everything from energy, land consumption, impacts on water quality, stormwater issues, habitat. Sprawl takes all these things. How do we provide services in these areas out there? And again, we just added a whole lot of developable land to our metropolitan footprint in a short amount of time. What does that do to property values? What does that do to property taxes? So as you can see with all these secondary impacts, one of the messages that we think is really important to get across, and I think it's very well represented with the people in the room, is that AVs are not a transportation issue. E-commerce is not a retail issue. These are everything issues. If we only think of these things as AVs as transportation issues, then the only people we bring into the room are people from our DOTs, people from our transportation sector. If we only think of retail or e-commerce as a retail issue, then the only people we're bringing into the room are people in the retail industry and people who are working on economic development. The changes that we're going to need to make on the regulatory side, on the way we work, on the way we communicate, are much broader than any of those two areas. They're going to take the whole city. So the two reasons to really think about that these things are not limited is one, because as I just showed before, I really think it's true, and as you can see from the program of things that we're going to be looking at, I absolutely think it's true. And two, if we're going to build the political support and the coalitions that let us make the changes that we need to be making, then we need to make sure that we are much broader in our approaches, that we bring people from all these different sectors together and all these different disciplines together. One of the issues that we run into as we have given talks all around the country on these topics is a reaction. We call this pulling back the curtain and starting to show people like these are kind of the impacts. That, if you just kind of take down this logically what's going to happen, these are the impacts. And the reaction always is, oh my goodness, and then what do? I just feel flooded with the amount of changes, the amount that the land is going to be changing underneath our feet. And so what we've been working really hard at Urbanism Next to do is to create a framework that helps people understand how exactly these changes are going to be happening and how to think about it. So the Urbanism Next framework, which is all in your programs, we're presenting it today for the first time, has three parts. It's got the basic elements. These are the secondary impacts, and we've organized those around land use, urban design, transportation, and real estate. And then we have the kind of the whys, the implications on equity, health, environment, the economy, and governance. And we think this is a really useful way for us to think about, these are the topics that we need to be thinking about. So everything from, equity has to do with affordability and accessibility. Health, we're talking, lots of issues of access, opportunities for access, but then huge issues of might be impacting things like obesity, opportunities for improvement in all these things. Environment, as I mentioned before, lots of issues with land consumption, stormwater, habitat, energy. The economy, everything from like, can we have our cities continue to function? Are they going to have revenue for these things? What's going to happen to the labor pool when 4 million people who are drivers in this country no longer have work? What happens with the retail sector when all of a sudden everyone who's working in the retail areas is replaced by e-commerce? And some of these jobs are going to be replaced by new jobs. They might not need the same skills, and they might not be in the same places. And then government structures. How is our government structure? How do we make decisions? How do we communicate? We think this framework is really helpful to help us all think ahead to stay ahead. And we think cities, and when we say cities, we don't just mean the public sector, but all of us that work in cities, thinking ahead to be able to stay ahead and prepare ourselves for the changes that are coming. And we also think a really important piece to all of this, and I think I'm very proud to be working in the Portland region and in the Pacific Northwest, because there's an ethos of the reason that we do things is for quality of life and livability. And I think we need to start with all these issues with community goals first, and then figure out how do we leverage these technologies in the issues to build on these issues. At U of O, with Urbanism Next, we're working a whole lot on these topics, and we want to continue. This is just a piece of this conference here in the next few days is just a piece of what we're doing. Urbanismnext.org and .edu is a blog where we've been organizing a whole lot of our research. We've got urbanismnext.com, which is the website that all of you were on to register for this. We'll be continuing to use that as a dissemination source. There's research reports, many of them that are up in the front that you can take a look at. One of the big steps that's going to happen right after we finish with this is the Clearinghouse that we're going to be developing, which is based on the framework that we put together, bringing together best practices, the latest research, information sharing around this, tools for cities, and tools for researchers from around the country and around the world. We've been developing a national network, and we're working on real projects with cities, many of the cities represented here, and we're looking forward to doing more with that. With the conference, this is really we see this as a fantastic opportunity. What started with fear and concern, I think, as we started to dig into these, has really turned much more into hope and optimism because of all of the people who are here right now, because of all of you that are here right now. Part of, I think, what we need to do is get together, put our shoulders into this, work together on these topics, build off of each other, share information, work collaboratively, and leverage all the work that we're doing, all the things that we're discovering, because there's a whole lot of discovery to be made, to help leverage these technologies to make better outcomes for all of our communities.